Massachusetts has some of the most segregated schools in the country, and a messy history of trying to address that problem. Last week, a coalition of students and community organizations filed suit in Suffolk Superior Court arguing that the state is maintaining that segregation by tying school assignment to where children live, in a state where neighborhoods are deeply divided by race and income. And that practice, they say, is violating the state constitution. The state's response was essentially, we understand segregation is an issue, but we don't have the authority to change district lines or the ways that districts actually address this issue. And our overall achievement numbers, they said, are still strong. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. We have a few different perspectives on the lawsuit at our website, CommonWealthBeacon.org, if you want to check those out. But my guest today is Dan O'Brien, professor of public policy and urban affairs at Northeastern University and co-director of the Boston Area Research Initiative. He and his team took a look at how Boston has tried to tackle segregation in 2018. So we're going to chat about what he's seen in New England's largest city since then, and what it could tell us about how the state might try to address segregation with its more limited jurisdiction. So, Dan, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jennifer.
So one of the reasons that we're talking about this today is that you did a kind of deep dive into how Boston itself has kind of tried to address the issue of segregation in its school districts, what's worked, what hasn't, different attempts that they've made at it. But let's start at kind of this high level here. When the city of Boston was coming to you and saying, we're trying to figure out how we can improve this, what were they pointing out as the problem? What's the issue with having segregated schools?
So interestingly enough, when they approached me, they had already tried to solve the problem with a brand new plan they called the home-based assignment plan, and they were asking me to evaluate whether it worked or not. And the plan itself was actually a really creative approach to dealing with the challenge of integrating schools in a de facto residentially segregated city. And what it did was it developed an algorithm or relied on an algorithm that looked at every student's home location and the nearest schools to that home location to be able to construct what they called a basket of options that guaranteed equal access to high quality schools. So then every student received access to the two nearest top tier schools and the three nearest in the top two tiers, and so on and so forth. And this tried to deal with the issue of accessing good schools close to home. Because I think the big lesson of the 1970s desegregation movement was that at the end of the day, everybody, white people, people of color, rich people, low-income people, everybody wants access to a high-quality school that is, in fact, close to their home. No one really wants to have to go all the way across the city to access education.
And so one of the sort of key findings in the report itself, as you were going through, was this persistent characterization, which is that these high quality schools were concentrated in historically white neighborhoods. So if you're building an assignment system around proximity, what are you actually encoding?
That's exactly the issue. Right? Most of our high quality schools in Boston are in, as you say, historically white, historically affluent neighborhoods. There are definitely exceptions to that rule, but then you also run into the issue that you have more kids in communities of color and in middle and working class neighborhoods. And so you have more families competing for fewer high quality seats. And at that time, at least, there were some extreme examples where, say, students in Mattapan had no access to high quality schools within a few miles of their home. But then you did have parts of, say, Dorchester or Roxbury or East Boston that were majority minority that had access to high quality schools, but the higher number of kids there was actually making the competition for those spaces higher. So then you had kind of these compounding forms of inequity, limiting how much access many of our kids and many of the kids who, the intention of desegregation was to support to access high quality schools, they were still struggling to get that access.
And so the lawsuit that we're seeing right now, which is against the state, arguing that the number of students in highly segregated school districts is essentially in violation of the state constitution, the rights that are granted in terms of access to equal education, equal opportunity for its students. And one of the things that it pointed to, which is very interesting, is that the segregation is often causing kind of a problem between districts, not just inside of a district. And so the state's position is, well, we're kind of limited in what we can do because so much of the way that school policy ends up playing out is an intra-district question. So, can you walk me back a little bit as you've been looking at what this looked like in Boston schools? What does it mean for inside a school district itself to have kind of these high levels of segregation?
So within a school district, it's in theory a tractable problem, legally speaking, right? Because the school district has jurisdiction over all of its schools and then the policies that distribute kids or allocate kids across those schools. I think what's fascinating about this lawsuit is the attempt to sort of upscale that jurisdiction, right? That responsibility to the state, which doesn't actually exist, right? In a sense, every school district, every town has its own jurisdiction over its schools and therefore how they allocate kids within their jurisdiction. So it's a fascinating legal pirouette, if you will, to try to figure out how to have the logic that applied to Boston apply to the state. In Boston, though, I think another thing that's going to be interesting about the conversations around this lawsuit is the conclusions within Boston were that busing kids across the city made nobody happy. And I certainly don't want to speak for all, communities of color and their arguments, but I've definitely had colleagues and friends and families in those communities say, why can't we just have high quality schools here? We don't want our kids necessarily to have to go to some other neighborhood that, we don't necessarily have a connection to, that's going to be a long distance travel. It makes all sorts of difficulties with access. It makes difficulty sometimes with being a part of, say, sports teams or other clubs after school. It makes a difference oftentimes with feeling included, right, in the community that you're traveling to. Nobody is loving that solution. So then the question really becomes for Boston and then for this kind of discussion of the state as a whole is, well, how do we just equalize our educational opportunities rather than solutions that involve busing kids all over the place?
So I'm so glad that you brought that up because one of the responses to the lawsuit, which is sort of interesting because it doesn't ask for very specific remedies like, expand the Metco program even further, bus people in a specific way. But one of the responses has kind of been, to your point, that it's not really about moving students, but, invest in urban neighborhoods so that you've got mixed income families who might choose to be there, boost those sort of local school systems, make them attractive, but also don't, make the quality of education dependent on whether or not it is attractive for the wealthiest folks to move around the neighborhood. So from a research standpoint, what do we know about whether a place-based approach works here?
That is the key question. And that is the key challenge. There have been some districts who have had success with it, and even states, right? So there's been a lot of discussion lately of the turnaround in Mississippi specifically, where they have been using some very very intentional practices around reading at very young ages and using kind of more recent evidence-based approaches. And they have seen real bump ups in their educational outcomes over the last 5 years or so. And those appear to be relatively equitable for a state that often struggles with disparities between white and non-white students. Locally, a few years ago, probably almost a decade now, Brockton received a lot of attention for a big turnaround. And that one was often attributed to leadership, right? Superintendent and principal leadership kind of establishing policies and such that created the turnaround. The reality of the matter, though, is that there's no silver bullets, right? Something that you can find evidence for in one evaluation or even 10 evaluations, you will find situations where it didn't work necessarily. And then the question becomes, well, is it that the intervention has its weaknesses, or that it's really about implementation and it's really hard to measure like how well a particular faculty or a particular district implemented a thing. And so it's really about problem solving, I think, at the local level and figuring out what is going to work here, what is going to work for us, given our unique characteristic set of challenges. Because, yeah, if the goal is to achieve equal outcomes, you've got to address the equity issue, which is these communities are coming from different starting places, right? The adults in the community may have different levels of education. So those kids are going home to different levels of kind of preparedness to help them with their homework. Or, there's all sorts of stats that came out, also about a decade ago, about how kids in different communities, like the number of words they hear before they're 5 years old, based on the education level of their parents, but also the education level of their neighbors, right? And all of those other things. So it's really a very complicated, multifaceted problem that, in my opinion, it sounds very simplistic to say this, but just needs very concentrated efforts and resources to figure out place by place, how do we support the kids who are there.
I'm glad that we're also talking about change over time and lessons that we learned a decade ago, a few decades ago, because this has been an ongoing, rolling discussion. When you're looking at Boston schools, to sort of focus on that for a second, being more segregated now than they were, say, 30 years ago, you looked at one of the particular kind of moments of trying to address that through policy. How do you tune specific policies? What does it tell you as a researcher when you see that these various attempts have not really kind of fixed it, whatever fixed it looks like?
It tells me that our research, right, our approach to research is really good at identifying things that could work. Right. And we're really good, especially in education research, which is often based on these randomized control trial approaches, where we take one thing and we try to isolate its effect. And that's really effective, because then you can come out afterwards and say, well, this type of reading intervention has X points of benefit to youth under the age of 8. And you can even look at more complex things, like this intervention has this much effect for kids who have this background versus that background, and so on and so forth. The problem, though, is as you get more and more targeted with identifying one effect, you lose track of the 1,000 other things that are happening simultaneously, and all of the interactions that might occur there. And so we can make a really nice sort of menu, if you will, of all the things that we have seen work somewhere, somehow. But without dozens of replications, we don't really know for certain what that's going to look like in the new space that we're moving into right now. So in some sense, what that tells me, though, is that's just a classic problem of public policy, right? You have to take the information that you get, right? It's not to say that all that research is bad. It's that it's informative. It's not determinative. It's not telling us this is the answer. It's telling us these are some potential options. Let's figure it out, and what we're going to do. And it's funny, thinking as a teacher, right? And I tell this to my students and my team members all the time when we're preparing something for teaching and delivering to folks, because we actually go into communities and do a lot of work around data and technology and kind of empowering people to own them for themselves. And there always comes a point when we're developing a program where I basically have to say to whoever on the team is leading, like, now you have to figure out how this works in your voice. Like, so I'll give you 4 options of what I think this could do, but you've got to pick the one that's going to work because you're the one implementing it. And I think that's going to be true for any school district, right? And their culture and their leadership and how the students currently understand learning, because they're already in the system, right? They already have concepts of how they learn and how they pick things up. And therefore, every district is going to have to look at that menu and say, which one is the one that feels right for us and that we think we can execute effectively to support our kids?
One thing that this sort of means that I'm kind of turning over in my mind is, Massachusetts, for depending on your perspective, for good or for ill, has a tremendous kind of history of local control, local character. The idea that these two neighborhoods or these two cities or towns might be right next to each other, but have kind of fundamentally different approaches to housing, to education, to all sorts of things. There are certain kind of state rules requiring a level of care and a level of quality. But I guess what I'm sort of getting at here is Boston in and of itself seemed like an interesting microcosm of there are sort of real differences in sort of the feelings between these different communities, and even figuring out how to work around that within a city was very complicated and remains very complicated, let alone the idea of Boston is right next to Brookline. How should those two school districts be interacting? How should students who live kind of on the border of either of those feel about what might be available to them in one city versus another city or town?
It's a really interesting question, and it begs, as you say, right, this tension between top down directives and bottom up fragmentation, if you will. And I think the answer is somewhere in between. And I do think Massachusetts has a reasonably good balance here already, but it should continue leaning into it, where I think Massachusetts, at least the last couple of administrations at the governor's level, and a lot of the towns, especially in the Boston area, have this understanding that there are opportunities for shared learning. Right? There are things that, whether they're universally true or not, they're at least informative to everybody, and we can pick things up from each other and have those conversations. And meanwhile, knowing that every district needs to figure out what is specifically needed on the ground for its community. Now, given there's sometimes parochiality that gets in the way of that, right? Entrenched opinions, maybe some minor competitions or rivalries that lead some municipalities not to pick up things that could be learned from another, things like that. But I think as much as you can get past those things and the state can really continue to foster those sorts of conversations, like hosting a symposium once a year or multiple times a year on particular topics that are of pressing issue to educators across the state, and maybe themed around things like this lawsuit and the kinds of questions it raises. I think that actually could be the most obvious value of this lawsuit, is to draw attention to this issue of segregation, but more so than segregation, the inequities that result from that segregation, and then drive further conversations, further learning, so that districts can do what they're probably all already trying to do more effectively.
And one thing that we've sort of danced around a little bit here is there are a few different ways, obviously, that districts can be segregated. There's racial segregation, there's income segregation. Boston has, over time, and as has Massachusetts, kind of tried to figure out to what extent do you literally talk about racial segregation? To what extent are you using proxies for that? So can you give me a little bit of a primer on your understanding when you're seeing this kind of lawsuit, when you're seeing efforts within a city to address segregation? what are they talking about literally, and what are we kind of using as a substitute sometimes?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And again, I'm not a legal scholar, but I'll give some kind of some cliff notes, if you will, on the distinction between the two legally. And I think this is kind of fascinating. So you can talk about racial segregation, right? And you can address it directly through things like busing and Metco programs and stuff like that as civil rights law, right? Because you're basically identifying a group by its ethnic or racial heritage, right? Having differential lack of access. Right? So then you can do that and you can target race in that context. But all of the other solutions, and when you look at these conversations that are being had around the lawsuit, both by the state saying, well, this is what we can do, and even some of the parties to the lawsuit sort of saying, well, we know you really can't desegregate actively. What we really want you to do is invest. What we really want you to do is put the resources behind making the majority minority school districts competitive in an educational way with the others. That you can't define by race. You're not allowed to do that, right? Because that would be technically a form of racial discrimination, which itself is a violation of civil rights law. So and it's really funny. So we actually, when we were doing the project on the home-based assignment plan back in 2018, we were also doing another project with the district on what was called an opportunity index. And we were analyzing MCAS scores across neighborhoods in the district to figure out how to support schools to have the appropriate resources to support their kids, taking into account what we referred to as what they were carrying in their backpacks, right? What they brought from home and their neighborhoods, right? Because different schools serve different neighborhoods or a different kind of melange or mixture of neighborhoods. And so thinking about it that way, and what we found was one of the biggest predictors of MCAS scores at the neighborhood level, so the average MCAS score in a neighborhood, was the percentage of non-white residents. And this was probably accounted for by things like, educational attainment of neighbors and parents and things of that nature, and all sorts of other kind of legacies of past very systematically racist systems. But what we realized was we couldn't actually design this opportunity index, which was intended to support the distribution of dollars. We couldn't design around those variables. That wasn't legal. And so then we had to use all of the proxies, right, as you're saying, right? So things like just median income, but then other census measures that I just mentioned, things like educational attainment of the community and others that they account for a lot of the mechanism of why communities of color, on average, tend to have lower achievement scores, in this case on MCAS, than majority white communities, but they don't account for all of it. And so it's a little bit of a complicated dance where there are situations where you can cite race, but there are other ones where you cannot. And then all you're left with is the proxies. And the proxies are reasonably effective, but they're not perfect. And they miss out on some of that sort of legacy of systematic inequalities that, are just sort of embedded in society.
So thinking about Boston again, because I do think it's kind of an interesting case study here, is so it's tried more than plenty of other cities and towns to move students around, try and kind of fine tune what the local offerings might be. So we were looking at options like busing, controlled choice, a neighborhood proximity model. So in your research, when you were looking at this, was there any version or any model here that had maybe a closer delta between the amount of effort it took and sort of the payoff in terms of addressing that segregation, or was it what you were sort of referring to earlier, which is a real set of upside downsides that take a lot of hyper local tuning?
Yeah, it's a really good question because it depends both on the system, right, the policy, but it also depends on how families are going to take advantage of that policy. And what we did find was once you got somewhere around 1.5 to 2 miles away from the home, or 1.5 to 2 miles further than a nearer school, the difference between a state classified tier 1 and tier 3 school was kind of negligible from a parental perspective, because we looked at school choice submissions into the lottery, to look at that, and we basically found that families prioritized being close to home as much as they prioritized quality. And so they were consistently trading this off. So, from that logic, if you start giving people access to more and more high quality schools, but that are far away from their homes, they're not even considering them. Right? They don't even make it into their list of options. And if they do, they kind of put them low, right? And they sort of rather rank top choices as nearby schools. So there's really a diminishing effect of folks taking advantage of the policy if you're offering them. Basically, if you define it as, oh, we offered you more good schools, but you leave out the part of the sentence where you're like, well, they're further away from you. It's like, well, I didn't really want that, right? I don't need that. And so yeah, so there's this point at which no matter, and we played around with a bunch of different algorithms for tweaking the home based plan, and they were all relatively negligible when we simulated how people might take advantage of them. So yeah, there's really a point of diminishing returns.
So, since you did that initial research, it's been about 8 years since then. What have you been watching? I'm going to start with on the city level in terms of how Boston has either tweaked or not tweaked, how it's approached its literalizing or sort of proxy based systems for thinking about where students are and how they can move and what they have access to. What's that looked like in Boston for you? Granted that we've already thrown the kind of, lampshade over it that segregation in Boston remains pretty profound.
Yeah, I think the conversation has shifted away from the assignment system, right? The lottery and assignment system, right? That was the big conversation in the 2010s. The idea in 2013, when they did this whole competition to redesign it, was like, this is going to be the answer. And then part of the whole legislation that was passed to do that said that they were required to do an evaluation, and that was the evaluation that we did in 2018. And we found out that it was kind of an answer. It had some modest benefits. It did have kids going to school a little closer to home overall. It didn't really shift the needle too much in terms of equitable access to high quality schools. So it was a little bit of a mixed bag. It was definitely nothing to throw a party about, and it managed to fuel some salacious headlines in terms of pockets of lack of access. So I think that what that did do, which might be a good thing, I think it actually probably is a good thing, is that it shifted the conversation to, well, then we really just need to figure out how to get schools in all parts of the city to be high quality, right? Because playing with this thing with not yet imagined solutions, imagining that one eventually is going to solve the problem definitively, it became clearer and clearer that that just was never going to happen. That you're dealing with diminishing returns, and so I think the conversation in Boston over the last 8 years, as you say, has been much more centered around how do we distribute resources appropriately, how do we support communities that have less often had power in the past to really kind of self-determine how they engage with the educational system, and therefore how they succeed. And I think that's the conversation that's taken part in Boston. I wouldn't say it's been some grand turnaround or anything. I'm not seeing the numbers shift dramatically, although there's been the pandemic in between, right? There's all sorts of other complicating factors. So I'm not saying it's like, oh, look, they solved it. Now the state should just do what they did. But at the same time, I think it's good in its realism that that other approach. I think we've gotten past the point of naively thinking that desegregation in and of itself was the answer, and I hope that the conversation spurred by this lawsuit can get to that point relatively quickly as well.
And I think that's going to be the last thing that we're going to touch on here, which is because the question of what the solution would be to this kind of known problem of segregation in Massachusetts schools is very open-ended. There's been kind of an interesting response from the state, which was sort of, thank you, we know this is a problem. We're limited in what we can do about it, but almost, not kind of an antagonistic response sort of by its nature. And so as you're looking ahead at how this plays out, which seems like it's as much going to be policy discussion as it is a legal discussion, what do you sort of expect to come up based on your experience of watching how this is kind of played out inside Boston?
I hope that, as you're implying here, right, I hope that it actually transitions from a legal discussion into a policy discussion and does so rather quickly. To be honest, and again, I'm not a legal scholar, I don't see a lot of pathways forward legally. The state does not have jurisdiction over what the plaintiffs are claiming they have jurisdiction over. And so, in all honesty, the state could have swatted this away probably. And it would be, as you say, it would be antagonistic or dismissive. But they could have probably, and they would have just wasted a few dozen hours of lawyer fees. Instead, what they did was basically say, here's what we can do, and here are the things we're focused on. And I hope that that's not like polite dismissiveness. I hope that that ends up coming to sort of an invitation to the table. I'm almost thinking of this. It's funny. I was as I've been reading these comments back and forth, it almost seems to me like an analog to coming to a settlement, like in a contentious lawsuit. Like maybe we should just put the lawyers away and sit down and figure out what we agree upon and what we don't agree upon. But it's an intellectual or an action-based settlement. Like, as I said, they should have a conference, right? They should have some sit downs. They should really commit to having these conversations and figuring out what we do next. And hopefully the lawsuit kind of is seen a year or 5 years from now as having stimulated a really important conversation.
Okay, well, Dan, we're going to leave it there for now, but I so appreciate you being here to talk with me about it.
It's my pleasure. This is a lot of fun.
Thanks again to Dan O'Brien for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is by Charlie Cazella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back in your ears next week.